Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
"Give me the keys," Julian snapped, his voice cutting through the hushed murmurs of the funeral guests. "You don't look like you belong in a car like this anyway." Elena Vance stood in the center of the marble foyer, the weight of her father's death still a heavy stone in her chest. She looked up at her brother, Julian, who was already dressed in a bespoke Italian suit that probably cost more than her son's tuition for the year. He didn't look like a man in mourning. He looked like a man who had just won the lottery and was impatient to collect his prize. The cloying, sweet scent of thousands of white lilies filled the air, thick enough to choke the breath from her lungs. Around them, the elite of the city stood with champagne flutes in hand, their eyes darting between the two siblings. Beatrice Vance, their mother, stood just a few feet away, dabbing at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. She didn't intervene. She never did when it came to her golden son. "The car was a gift from Dad, Julian," she said, her voice low and steady. She felt the cold, jagged edges of the key fob digging into her palm, a tactile anchor against the rising tide of her temper. "He gave it to me when Leo was born. It's the only reliable thing I have." Julian laughed, a sharp, entitled sound that made a few guests flinch. He stepped closer, invading her personal space, the smell of expensive bourbon and arrogance radiating off him. "It's a vintage Porsche, Elena. It's a collector's item, not a grocery getter for a struggling single mom. You're a forensic auditor. Surely you can calculate the depreciation you're causing just by sitting in those leather seats." "Julian, please," Beatrice whispered, though she didn't look at him. She looked at Elena with a pleading, weary expression. "Not today. Don't make a scene in front of the Vance's friends. Just give him what he wants so we can have some peace." Elena felt the familiar sting of the family dynamic. It was always the same. Julian demanded, and Elena was expected to sacrifice to keep the peace. But their father was in a mahogany casket in the next room, and the peace Julian wanted was built on the ruins of Elena's dignity. She glanced toward the shadows of the library door, where Sela's thorn stood. The family lawyer remained motionless, his face an unreadable mask, but his eyes were fixed on Elena. He held a leather-bound folder against his chest, the final audit of Arthur Vance's estate. Only Elena and Sela's knew the truth that lay within those pages. Her father hadn't been the silent, distant man she thought he was. He had been a strategist, and he had spent his final months building a fortress around the daughter he knew would be hunted by her own blood. "I'm not giving you the keys," she said, her voice gaining a cold, crystalline edge. Julian's face darkened, the mask of the grieving son slipping to reveal the predatory gambler beneath. He reached out, his fingers hovering near her throat as he adjusted the collar of her modest black coat. "You've always been so difficult. Dad felt sorry for you, that's why he gave you the car. But the party's over, Elena. You're a glorified bookkeeper living in a rented townhouse. You don't belong at the Gables, and you certainly don't belong in that car." He turned to the room, raising his voice so the witnesses, the board members, the socialites, the vultures could hear. "My sister seems to think she's entitled to assets she can't afford to maintain. It's sad, really. The grief has clearly clouded her judgment." A ripple of judgmental whispers moved through the crowd. Elena saw the way they looked at her, the disappointing Vance daughter who had walked away from the family business to chase numbers in cold offices. They saw a victim. Julian saw a target. Elena didn't look away. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small digital recorder, clicking it off. She had captured every word, the demand, the insult, the public humiliation. It was a habit from her work, one Julian was too arrogant to anticipate. "You're right about one thing, Julian," she said, stepping toward him until he was forced to back up. "I am a forensic auditor. I see things other people miss. For instance, I noticed the $3 million hole in the Vance Holdings offshore accounts. And I noticed the signature on the wire transfers matches the one on your gambling markers in Macau." Julian's face went from flushed red to a sickly, chalky white in less than a second. His hand, the one reaching for the keys, began to tremble. He opened his mouth to retort, but the words died in his throat as Sela's thorn stepped forward, the heavy folder now open in his hands. "The reading of the will is tomorrow at 10, Silas said, his voice like dry parchment. "Until then, Julian, I suggest you leave your sister alone. She is the only person in this room who currently has the power to decide whether you spend the next decade in a boardroom or a federal cell." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the bubbles in the champagne seemed to stop rising. Julian looked around the room, realizing the witnesses he had gathered to humiliate his sister were now watching his collapse with rapt, predatory interest. Elena felt a strange, cold calm settle over her. The sleeping lion her father had mentioned in his final letter was finally awake. She looked at the portrait of Arthur Vance hanging above the fireplace, a man who had protected her in the only way he knew how. "Keep the champagne, Julian," she said, her voice echoing in the stillness. "You're going to need it, because when I'm done with the audit of this house, you won't even own the suit you're wearing." She turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors, the sound of her heels clicking against the marble like a countdown. She didn't look back at her mother's shocked face or Julian's trembling fury. She had a plan, she had the evidence, and for the first time in her life, she held all the cards. As she stepped out into the crisp autumn air, she pulled out her phone and dialed a number she had kept saved for years. "It's Elena," she said when the line picked up. "The wake is over. It's time to start the liquidation." The next morning, the bitter scent of over-roasted espresso and the sharp, metallic tang of heirloom silver clinking against porcelain hung heavy in the breakfast room. Elena Vance stood in the doorway, her hand gripping the cold, smooth handle of her leather briefcase. She watched her brother, who was lounging at the head of the long mahogany table as if he'd already inherited the crown. Julian Vance didn't even look up from his phone, his thumb flicking dismissively across the screen while he shoveled a forkful of eggs into his mouth. Beatrice Vance sat to his right, her posture rigid, her eyes scanning a jeweler's appraisal list. She looked up as Elena entered, her expression shifting from calculation to a weary, practiced condescension. "You're still here, Elena," Beatrice said, not as a question, but as an accusation. "I thought you'd have packed your bags and headed back to your little apartment by now. There's nothing left for you to do here but make things difficult." "I'm not here for a visit, Mother," Elena replied, her voice steady and devoid of the tremor that used to define her interactions with this family. She walked to the table, the sound of her heels on the marble floor echoing like a rhythmic countdown. Julian finally looked up, a smirk dancing on his lips. "Still playing the sleeping lion bit? It was a good line last night, really, very dramatic, but let's be real. You're a forensic auditor for a mid-sized firm in the city. You look at spreadsheets for a living. This is the real world, and in the real world, the house belongs to the person who can actually maintain it." He gestured vaguely at the ornate ceiling. "I've already contacted an estate agent. We're moving the Vance collection to auction by Friday. Dad's debts won't pay themselves." The audacity of his lie was breathtaking. Elena knew for a fact that their father, Arthur, had left the estate unencumbered. Any debts belonged solely to Julian and his penchant for high-stakes underground poker. "The Vance collection isn't yours to move, Julian," she said, pulling a thick, tabbed folder from her briefcase. She slid it across the table. It came to a rest right against his espresso cup. "And as for my job, you're right, I look at spreadsheets. I find the money people think they've hidden. I find the signatures they thought they forged. And most importantly, I find the authority to stop them." Julian didn't open the folder. He laughed, a dry, jagged sound. "Is that what they call being a glorified bookkeeper these days? Forensic auditor. It sounds so much more important than disappointing daughter, doesn't it?" "Elena, please," Beatrice interrupted, her voice dripping with a faux-maternal concern that felt like venom. "Your brother has real responsibilities. He has debts, important debts, to people who don't care about your little audits. Don't be selfish. Your father would have wanted Julian to be taken care of first. He was the son. He is the legacy. The legacy is a hollow shell because you've spent 20 years pouring everything into a man who would sell your wedding ring for a pair of pocket aces," Elena said. She turned her gaze back to her brother. "I've spent the last 6 hours looking through the digital backups of Dad's private server. Do you know what I found, Julian? I found the loans you took out in his name while he was in the hospice. I found the power of attorney you tried to file 3 days before he died. The one the notary refused to sign because Dad wasn't conscious. Julian's face didn't pale yet. He was still too wrapped in his own perceived invincibility. Instead, his eyes narrowed, a flash of genuine malice flickering in the dark iris. You're treading on very thin ice, Elena. If you think you can come in here and claim a piece of this house after ignoring this family for years, you're mistaken. I'm the executor. I've already signed the papers. You signed papers for a ghost, Elena said. She leaned forward, placing her palms flat on the table. Dad knew exactly who you were. He knew you'd try to strip the house bare the moment the dirt hit his coffin. That's why he didn't make you the executor of the Vance estate. He made me the sole trustee of the Vance Family Trust, which owns this house, the land, and every single piece of art you've already promised to your creditors. The silence that followed was absolute. Beatrice's appraisal list fluttered from her fingers, landing on the floor with a soft thud. Julian's smirk didn't just fade, it curdled. You're lying, he hissed, his voice dropping an octave. He wouldn't do that. He loved me. He loved the son he hoped you'd be. He protected the daughter he knew you'd hunt, Elena corrected. She straightened up, checking her watch. It's 9:00 a.m. In exactly 72 hours, a full inventory team will arrive. Every item in this house will be cataloged and cross-referenced with the 2018 insurance manifest. If so much as a silver spoon is missing, I'm filing a criminal complaint for grand larceny. She began to turn away, but Julian lunged out of his chair, his face turning a mottled, angry purple. You think you can just walk in here and take my life? You're nothing. You're a ghost in this house. Elena didn't flinch as he moved toward her. She simply reached into her pocket and held up her phone. The screen showed an active call. I'm not alone, Julian, she said. A heavy knock sounded at the front door, 3 slow, deliberate strikes that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. That will be Sela's Thorn, Elena said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than his shouting. He's the one Dad trusted to hold the original deed, and he's brought the locks. She walked toward the foyer, leaving her brother and mother frozen in the wreckage of their breakfast, the countdown to their eviction finally audible in the ticking of the grandfather clock. 2 days after the locks were changed at the Vance estate, the air in the city felt heavy with the scent of impending rain and ozone. Elena Vance sat in the back of a modest car, her eyes fixed on the glass and steel monolith that housed Thorne and Associates. The transition from the sprawling, suffocating halls of her childhood home to the sterile precision of a legal firm felt like emerging from a fever dream. Her hands, resting on a leather briefcase, were perfectly still. She wasn't the trembling girl who had been pushed into the shadows of her brother's light. She was a forensic auditor, and she was about to balance the books. Sela's Thorn was waiting for her in an office that smelled of aged cedar and expensive tobacco. He didn't offer a smile. He offered a heavy, cream-colored folder. The man Arthur Vance had trusted above all others looked at Elena with a grim sort of respect. He had watched her grow up as the reliable one, the one who stayed quiet while Julian Vance burned through the family's goodwill like a brushfire. Your father called this the North Star, Silas said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate the heavy mahogany desk between them. He knew Julian would try to liquidate the holding company the moment the soil settled. He also knew Beatrice would sign whatever Julian put in front of her. Elena opened the folder. Her eyes scanned the columns of numbers, her mind moving with the clinical speed of a machine. She felt a sharp, cold thrill, a sensory anchor in the sea of her family's chaos. It was the North Star Revelation, a secret trust that held the controlling interest in Vance Global, one that Julian didn't even know existed. To Julian, the company was a piggy bank. To Elena, it was a map of his crimes. He's already moved the funds, hasn't he? Elena asked. She didn't need the answer. She could see the discrepancy in the ledger. 7 million, Silas confirmed. Transferred to an offshore account in the Caymans 36 hours ago. He thinks he's secured his safety net before you can freeze the domestic assets. The audacity of it was a physical weight in the room. Julian wasn't just losing the house. He was actively stealing the remains of their father's legacy to fund a life he hadn't earned. Elena felt the familiar sting of her brother's entitlement, a rage spike that warmed her blood. He had always taken the largest piece of the pie and complained it wasn't sweet enough. The silence of the office was shattered by the shrill vibration of Elena's phone. It was Julian. She answered, putting it on speaker. "I hope you're enjoying the view from whatever gutter you've crawled into, Elena." Julian's voice dripped with a terrifying, manic confidence. "I just bought a Ferrari, the 812 GTS. Red, obviously. I put it on the company's line of credit. Consider it a moving-out gift to myself since you're so obsessed with the deed to a house that's falling apart anyway." Elena didn't flinch. She watched the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, each second a rhythmic countdown. "A Ferrari, Julian, that seems impulsive even for you." "Impulsive, it's a statement. It says I'm still the head of this family, no matter what scrap of paper you and that old vulture Thorne are clinging to. Mom and I are having dinner at Le Cirque tonight. Don't bother showing up. The reservation is for people who actually matter." He hung up without waiting for a response. The arrogance was a toxic perfume, filling her mind with the image of him laughing while the company bled out. He truly believed he was untouchable because he had been told he was his entire life. Beatrice Vance had spent 30 years shielding him from the consequences of his own rot, and now the rot had consumed the foundation. "He has no idea," Silas whispered, looking at the North Star documents. "Let him have his dinner," Elena said, her voice like the snap of a winter branch. "Let him enjoy the champagne and the leather seats of a car he'll never truly own. Every cent he spends today is another nail in the coffin I'm building for him." She stood up, the movement fluid and decisive. She had the weapon now, the undeniable proof that Julian had committed fiduciary fraud on a massive scale, but she wouldn't use it yet. A public reveal required a public stage. The Vance Global Annual Gala was in 24 hours. It was the one night of the year when the city's elite gathered to celebrate the family's success. It was the night Julian expected to be crowned as the permanent CEO. "Is everything ready for tomorrow?" Elena asked, her hand hovering over the briefcase. "The board has been notified of an emergency session during the gala," Silas replied. "They think it's a routine confirmation. They have no idea they're attending an execution." Elena left the office, stepping out into the cool evening air. She thought of Leo Vance, her son, sleeping soundly in the small apartment they had shared while Julian lived in a palace. She was doing this for the boy who deserved a name that stood for integrity, not theft. She touched the cold, brass key in her pocket, the key to the private vault Silas had mentioned. As she walked toward her car, she saw a flash of red streak past the intersection, a Ferrari engine roaring with a desperate, hungry sound. Julian was out there, celebrating a victory that had already been stolen from him. He thought he was the lion, but he was just a wolf caught in a trap he hadn't even noticed yet. Elena checked her watch. 24 hours. The countdown was no longer a whisper in a hallway. It was a drumbeat in her chest. She had the evidence, she had the ally, and she had the patience of a woman who had waited a lifetime for justice. Tomorrow, the North Star would rise, and Julian Vance would finally learn what happens when the ghost in the house decides to speak. The day before the Vance Foundation Gala, the family estate was a hive of frantic, expensive activity. Elena Vance stood on the second-floor landing, her hand resting on the polished mahogany railing as she watched a small army of florists arrange thousands of white lilies in the foyer below. The scent was overwhelming, cloying and sweet, like a funeral masquerading as a celebration. She felt the weight of the brass key in her pocket, a cold, jagged reminder of the vault she had visited only hours ago. The documents were safe now, tucked into a slim leather portfolio hidden beneath the floorboards of her son's closet. Leo Vance was currently at school, oblivious to the fact that his mother was about to dismantle the only world he had ever known to build him a better one. "Admiring the view, or just making sure you don't trip over the help?" The voice was like a splash of acid. Elena didn't need to turn to know Julian Vance was standing behind her. She could smell the expensive, peat-heavy scotch on his breath even at 10 in the morning. She turned slowly, meeting her brother's bloodshot eyes with a calm that seemed to irritate him instantly. He was wearing a silk robe that cost more than a year of Leo's tuition, his hair perfectly coiffed despite his obvious hangover. "It's a lot of effort for one night," she said, her voice level. Julian let out a sharp, jagged laugh and leaned against the railing, looking down at the bustle. "It's not just a night, Elena. It's a coronation. Tomorrow, the board confirms the merger, and I officially step into the CEO chair. Father's legacy finally gets a leader with actual ambition, not just a penchant for dusty ledgers and integrity." He spat the last word as if it were a curse. "Ambition is a dangerous thing when it isn't anchored by the truth, Julian," she replied. She stepped closer, her movements deliberate. "You've spent so much time building this pedestal. Are you sure the foundation can hold the weight?" He narrowed his eyes, the smugness faltering for a fraction of a second before his mask of entitlement snapped back into place. "What is that supposed to mean? You've been acting like a cryptic ghost all week. If you're looking for a bigger payout to stay quiet about my extracurricular debts, forget it. You're lucky I'm letting you stay for the party at all." He reached out, his fingers smelling of expensive tobacco as he flicked a stray hair off her shoulder with a dismissive sneer. "Enjoy the view from the top today, Julian. The air gets very thin when the floor starts to disappear." "You're pathetic," he muttered, turning his back on her to shout a command at a florist who had misplaced a vase. "Make sure those lilies are centered. I'm not paying for almost perfect." Elena watched him for a moment longer, a silent witness to his arrogance. He had no idea that Sela's Thorn had already finalized the digital trail. The trap was no longer being built. The door was already swinging shut. She made her way downstairs, passing Beatrice Vance in the morning room. Her mother was draped in pearls, obsessively checking a seating chart. She didn't look up as Elena passed, her focus entirely on ensuring the city's elite were positioned according to their net worth. "Elena," Beatrice called out just as she reached the door. "Wear the navy silk tomorrow. It's understated. We don't need you drawing attention away from your brother's moment. This is his day." "I wouldn't dream of taking the spotlight away from him, Mother," Elena said, her hand on the door frame. "He's going to get exactly the kind of attention he deserves." Beatrice finally looked up, her brow furrowing at the strange, steely resonance in her daughter's voice. For the first time in years, she saw something in Elena that reminded her of Arthur. Not the quiet, compliant man he had pretended to be, but the strategist who had built an empire from nothing. But the thought was fleeting, dismissed by the urgent need to decide between salmon or sea bass. Elena stepped out onto the terrace, the crisp autumn air a welcome relief from the suffocating perfume of the lilies. She pulled her phone from her pocket and sent a 3-word message to Sela's. "Everything is ready." The reply came seconds later. "The North Star is positioned. See you at the finish line." She looked out over the manicured lawn, her heart beating with a steady, rhythmic thrum. The countdown had reached its final hours. Julian thought he was the master of this house, but he was merely a tenant in a structure built on lies. Tomorrow, the ghost would speak, and the Vance legacy would finally face the light of day. Elena took a deep breath, the cold air filling her lungs, and for the first time in a lifetime, she felt truly powerful. The lion was awake, and the wolf was still busy admiring his own reflection. The evening of the Vance Centennial Gala arrived with a heavy, oppressive stillness that the roaring fireplaces in the manor couldn't quite thaw. By 7 o'clock, the great hall was a sea of black ties and shimmering silk, the air thick with the scent of expensive cigar smoke and the cloyingly sweet aroma of vanilla orchids. Elena Vance stood at the edge of the mezzanine, her fingers tracing the cold, smooth silver of her father's signet ring, which she wore on a chain beneath her dress. She watched the crowd below, a collection of the city's most influential figures, all gathered to celebrate a legacy that was currently rotting from the inside out. Down in the center of the room, Julian Vance was already holding court. He looked every bit the heir apparent in a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo that likely cost more than a year of Leo's school tuition. He moved through the crowd with a predatory grace, a glass of vintage crystal permanently affixed to his hand. His laughter, loud and performatively confident, echoed off the vaulted ceilings. He was currently regaling a group of venture capitalists with the story of his latest acquisition. A deal Elena knew was nothing more than a desperate shell game to cover his mounting gambling markers. "He looks like he already wears the crown," a voice murmured beside her. Elena didn't need to turn to recognize the gravelly tone of Sela's Thorn. He stood a respectful foot away, looking crisp in a charcoal suit that lacked the flash of the other guests but carried a weight of its own. "Let him enjoy the weight of it for an hour longer," she replied, her voice a calm contrast to the frantic Vivaldi being played by the string quartet. "Does he suspect anything?" "He's too busy admiring his own reflection in the champagne," Silas said, his eyes never leaving the floor below. "The board members are all here. I've confirmed that the digital bridge is active. The moment you give the word, the files will be accessible to every tablet in this room." Elena felt a surge of cold adrenaline. It wasn't the shaking hands of a victim, but the steady pulse of a surgeon before the first incision. She glanced down at her clutch, where the weight of her phone felt like a loaded weapon. "And Beatrice. She's in the solarium with the Vance cousins," Silas noted, "ensuring the optics remain perfect. She still believes this night ends with Julian being named chairman for life." Elena nodded, her gaze returning to her brother. She watched Julian dismiss a waiter with a flick of his fingers, so arrogant it made her jaw tighten. He was the wolf her father had tried to cage, and tonight he was finally going to realize the cage had been the only thing keeping him safe from himself. As the chime for dinner rang, a melodic, silver sound that cut through the chatter, the guests began to migrate toward the grand dining room. The transition was a choreographed dance of status. Elena waited until the mezzanine was nearly empty before she descended the stairs. She felt the eyes of the remaining guests on her, the quiet Vance, the daughter who had spent her life in the shadow of Julian's manufactured brilliance. She didn't mind. Shadows were the best place to sharpen a blade. The dining room was a masterpiece of Victorian excess. A single mahogany table, long enough to seat 50, was draped in white damask and topped with towering silver candelabras. The heat from the hundreds of flames made the air shimmer. Elena found her seat, relegated to the far end of the table, naturally, away from the power seats reserved for Julian and the primary investors. Julian took his place at the head of the table, the seat their father had occupied for 40 years. Beatrice Vance sat to his right, her face a mask of regal satisfaction, her pearls catching the light of the candles. Julian leaned back, his arm draped over the ornate chair, looking for all the world like a king presiding over his subjects. The first course, a delicate truffle consommé, was served in silence, the only sound the rhythmic clink of silver against bone china. Julian waited until the wine was poured, a 1982 Bordeaux that had been their father's pride, before he cleared his throat. "I want to thank you all for being here," Julian said, his voice carrying that practiced, effortless charm. He didn't stand yet, preferring to command the room from his seated position of power. "Tonight is about more than just 100 years of the Vance name. It's about the next 100. My father was a man of tradition, but as we move forward, we must be bold. We must be willing to shed the weight of the past to embrace the profit of the future." Elena watched him over the rim of her glass. He was laying the groundwork for the sale of the Vance ancestral holdings, the land her father had sworn would never be touched. She felt a phantom heat in her chest, the rage of a daughter watching a thief brag about what he was about to steal. "Some people," Julian continued, his eyes drifting down the table until they landed on Elena, "prefer to stay buried in the ledgers of yesterday. They fear growth because they don't understand the vision required to achieve it." A few of his sycophants chuckled. Beatrice offered a thin, pitying smile toward her daughter. Elena didn't flinch. She took a slow, deliberate sip of the wine, the tart notes of dark fruit dancing on her tongue. "But vision," Julian said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone, requires capital. And tonight I am thrilled to announce that the North Star Initiative has reached its final funding goal. We are no longer just a legacy company, we are a global powerhouse. Beside her, a board member leaned in. Is that true? I heard there were liquidity issues. Elena didn't look at him. Wait for the toast, she whispered. The second course arrived, roasted venison with a blackberry reduction. The smell was rich and earthy, but the tension in the room was beginning to thicken like the sauce. Julian was riding high on the adrenaline of his own lies, his gestures becoming broader, his voice louder. He was at the peak of his perceived power, the golden boy who had finally saved the family. Elena checked her watch. 8:45 p.m. Sila's would be moving into the security hub now. She looked up to see Julian staring at her again. He looked annoyed by her composure, by the fact that she wasn't shrinking under his triumph. He signaled a waiter and pointed toward her. A moment later, a fresh glass of wine was placed in front of her, but as the waiter withdrew, Julian spoke up, loud enough for the entire table to hear. Elena, darling, you look so somber. Perhaps the audit department is finally getting to you. You should try to enjoy the evening. After all, it's not every day your brother saves the family from the logical path you were so fond of. I'm enjoying it more than you know, Julian, she said, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the ambient noise of the dinner. Julian smirked, turning back to the CEO of a major bank. She's always been the serious one. My father used to say she had the soul of an accountant and the heart of a frozen lake. The laughter that followed was sharper this time, fueled by the wine and the desire to stay in Julian's good graces. Beatrice leaned over and patted Julian's hand, a silent coronation of her favorite child. Elena reached into her clutch. Her fingers found the cool metal of her phone. She felt the vibration, a single, long pulse. Sila's was ready. Julian stood then, his chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. The room went silent instantly. He picked up his crystal flute, the bubbles in the champagne rising rapidly to the surface. He looked around the room, his chest puffed out, the light of the candelabras dancing in his eyes. To the Vance legacy, Julian announced, raising his glass high. And to the end of the old guard. May we always have the courage to take what is ours. He looked directly at Elena, a sneer of pure, unadulterated victory on his face. He began to bring the glass to his lips, the final seal on his supposed ascension. Elena's thumb hovered over the send button on her screen. She didn't look away from him. She didn't blink. She simply waited for the exact moment the glass touched his teeth. Actually, Julian, Elena said, her voice dropping the quiet mask and taking on the razor-sharp edge of a final judgment. Before we drink to the future, I think everyone should take a look at the present. She pressed the button. Across the room, 50 tablets and smartphones chimed in a dissonant digital chorus. Julian froze, the glass still pressed against his lip, as the first gasps of confusion began to ripple through the board members. The silence that followed the dissonant digital chorus was heavier than the toast Julian had just proposed. Across the sprawling boardroom, the blue light from 50 different screens reflected in the eyes of the Vance Group's most powerful allies. Julian remained frozen, his arm still half extended, the vintage champagne trembling in his crystal flute. He didn't look at his own phone. He didn't have to. The collective intake of breath from the board members told him exactly what Elena had unleashed. Elena stood perfectly still, her silhouette framed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. She watched the condensation from Julian's glass drip onto his expensive Italian leather shoes. The scent of cedarwood and lilies, usually so refined, suddenly felt cloying, like the air in a funeral parlor. "What is this?" Beatrice Vance was the first to speak. Her voice, usually a melodic instrument of social grace, was cracked and thin. She was staring at her tablet, her thumb hovering over a scanned image of a handwritten ledger, the real ledger Arthur Vance had kept in a safe Julian didn't know existed. "It's the truth, Mother," Elena said. Her voice wasn't loud, but in the vacuum of the room, it carried the weight of a gavel. "It's a forensic trail of every dollar Julian borrowed from the legacy fund to cover his losses at the tables in Macau." It's the record of the shell companies. He used to hollow out the Vance group, while he was busy telling you I was the one who didn't care about this family. Julian finally moved. He set the glass down on the mahogany table with a sharp asterisk clack that made several people jump. He tried to summon the sneer, the mask of the golden heir, but the muscles in his face refused to cooperate. His features didn't just change, they seemed to dissolve. The arrogant flush that had colored his cheeks during the toast vanished, replaced by a gray, sickly pallor that made him look a decade older in seconds. His lower lip developed a frantic, uncontrollable tremor, and his eyes, once sharp with malice, became glassy and unfocused, darting between the screens of the board members as if looking for a way to delete the truth from reality. He tried to speak, but his throat seemed to seize, producing only a wet, pathetic clicking sound as he struggled for air. His shoulders, usually held with the posture of a man who owned the sky, slumped forward as if the very air in the room had become leaden. This is a fabrication," Julian finally managed to wheeze, though his voice lacked any conviction. He looked at the board members, searching for a friendly face, but he found only a wall of cold, professional disgust. Sila's Thorn stood at the back of the room, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't say a word, but the slight, knowing nod he gave Elena was the only validation she needed. He had been the one to help her decode the final entries, the ones Arthur had encrypted with Elena's birth date. Beatrice looked from the screen to her son, her eyes wide with a dawning, horrific realization. She had spent years polishing Julian's image, shielding him from the consequences of his eccentricities, only to realize she had been decorating a sinking ship. She reached out to touch Julian's arm, but then, seeing the sheer scale of the embezzlement on the screen, the millions stolen from the very foundations of their name, she pulled her hand back as if he were made of hot iron. One of the senior board members, a man who had been Arthur's closest friend, stood up. He didn't look at Julian, he looked at Elena. "The documents are notarized," he whispered, his voice echoing the shock of the room. "The signatures, they're undeniable." Julian's eyes snapped to Elena. For a moment, the wounded wolf returned, his teeth bared in a desperate, final snarl. "You think you've won? You think they'll let a forensic accountant run a dynasty?" Elena stepped forward, her heels clicking once on the marble floor. She didn't look angry. She looked liberated. The weight of her father's silence, the years of being the difficult daughter, and the shadow of Julian's entitlement all evaporated in the heat of the truth. "I don't want to run your dynasty, Julian," Elena said, her voice a frozen blade that cut through his last shred of defiance. "I'm here to audit it, and the audit is officially closed." She reached into her small clutch, pulled out a single heavy brass key, the key to the Vance estate's main gates, and slid it across the table. It spun, ringing against the wood before coming to rest directly in front of Julian. "You told me the old guard was dead," she said, her gaze steady and cold. "But you forgot that the old guard kept better books than you. Security is already downstairs, Julian. They're waiting to escort you to the authorities. I suggest you don't keep them waiting." Without another word, Elena turned. She didn't look at her mother's stunned face or the board members who were already beginning to scramble. She walked toward the double doors, her head held high, the sound of her departure the only rhythm in a room full of ghosts. She left him there, standing in the wreckage of a toast that had turned to ash. The silence in the boardroom stretched for 10 agonizing seconds, a vacuum that seemed to suck the very oxygen from the air. Julian Vance didn't move. He stared at the heavy brass key resting on the mahogany table as if it were a live grenade. The celebratory bubbles in the champagne flutes nearby had gone flat, mirroring the sudden, deathly stillness of the room. Julian's face began a grotesque transformation that no amount of expensive grooming could hide. The mask of the golden heir didn't just slip, it disintegrated. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a sickly, grayish pallor that made his designer suit look like a shroud. His eyes, usually bright with a predatory spark, bulged with a raw, naked panic, the whites showing all the way around the irises as they darted frantically from the key to the stony faces of the board members. A bead of sweat broke out at his hairline, tracking a slow, glistening path through his foundation. His jaw worked silently, his teeth clicking together as his mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping on a pier. The skin around his lips turned a bruised, mottled purple, and his nostrils flared with every ragged, shallow breath. It was the look of a man who had forgotten how to breathe. "You're lying," he finally whispered, the words cracking like dry timber. He looked toward Beatrice Vance, his eyes wide and pleading, searching for the shield she had provided his entire life. "Mother, tell these people she's delusional. This is a stunt, a pathetic, jealous stunt." Beatrice didn't move to defend him. She sat frozen, her hand clutching her pearls so tightly the string looked ready to snap. She wasn't looking at her son. She was staring at the key, her face a mask of dawning, horrific realization. The regal posture she had maintained for decades finally buckled, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of the ceiling had suddenly dropped onto them. The board members, who had been laughing at Julian's jokes only minutes prior, were now physically recoiling. Mrs. Sterling, the most senior member of the Oversight Committee, pulled her chair back with a sharp, echoing scrape, her expression shifting from confusion to a cold, clinical disgust. Mr. Henderson, Julian's most vocal ally, was already hunched over his phone, his thumb flying across the screen as he signaled his exit from the coming wreckage. They weren't his supporters anymore. They were a jury, and the verdict was already written in the silence. The double doors at the far end of the room swung open with a heavy thud. Silas Thorne stepped inside. He had traded his canvas work jacket for a charcoal suit that fit him with the precision of a soldier's uniform. He carried a leather-bound ledger, the original hand-inked records that Arthur Vance had kept hidden from everyone but his most trusted friend. "The audit isn't just a formality, Julian," Silas said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that filled every corner of the room. "The forensic team has been inside the digital accounts for 3 weeks. We have the wire transfers to the offshore betting houses. We have the forged signatures on the pension fund withdrawals. It's not just a debt anymore. It's a crime." Julian lunged for the key, his fingers clawing at the wood, but his hands were shaking so violently he knocked it to the floor. It rang against the hardwood, skittering toward the feet of the board chairman. "I'll kill you," he hissed, turning his venom toward Elena. He looked like a cornered animal, his hair disheveled, the sweat now soaking his collar. "You think you can just walk in here and take my life? I am the Vance legacy. You are nothing but a glorified bookkeeper." Elena didn't flinch. She stood with her hands clasped loosely in front of her, her gaze steady and as cold as a winter morning. She didn't feel the need to shout. The power had shifted so completely that his rage felt like the buzzing of a fly against a window pane. "You aren't the legacy, Julian," she said, her voice cutting through his hysteria with surgical precision. "You're just the man who spent it. You told me earlier that I didn't belong in this room. You were right. I don't belong in a room full of lies and thieves, but I own the table you're sitting at." The 2 men in dark suits who had followed Silas into the room stepped forward. One of them reached into his jacket and produced a pair of steel handcuffs. The sound of the metal ratcheting shut, 3 sharp, mechanical clicks, was the finality the room needed. Julian's knees buckled. He didn't fight as they took his arms. He simply sagged, his strength evaporating as the reality of the handcuffs sank in. He let out a low, whimpering sound, a far cry from the arrogant man who had poured wine over Elena's dignity. As they led him toward the door, he looked back at Beatrice one last time, but she turned her head away, unable to look at the monster her indulgence had created. Elena turned to her mother. The older woman looked fragile, the light of her favoritism extinguished by the cold light of the audit. "He was all I had left of your father's spirit," Beatrice whispered, her voice trembling. "No," Elena replied, her tones softening but remaining firm. "He was the mask you used to ignore the truth. I'm the only one who actually kept what father valued." She didn't wait for a response. She didn't need the board's apologies or her mother's sudden, desperate approval. She walked out of the boardroom, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic beat on the marble floor. She passed through the foyer, past the portraits of the Vance ancestors, and stepped out into the cool evening air. Silas was waiting by her car, holding the door open. He gave her a single, respectful nod, the acknowledgement of a job finished. Inside the car, Leo was waiting, his face lighting up when he saw her. Elena sat back against the leather seat, feeling the weight of the last few years finally begin to lift. She had delivered the reckoning. Now, for the first time in her life, she was driving toward a future that belonged entirely to her. 6 months later, the morning air in the city felt crisp and unusually clear, a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of the Vance estate. Elena Vance stood in the center of her new office, the scent of fresh white lilies and roasted espresso beans filling the space. There were no heavy velvet curtains here, no portraits of stern ancestors staring down with silent judgment. Instead, the walls were glass and light, overlooking a skyline she was finally viewing as a participant rather than a prisoner. She smoothed the front of her charcoal silk blazer, her fingers brushing the cool, familiar weight of her father's silver signet ring, which she now wore on a chain beneath her shirt. The piece was interrupted by the sharp, rhythmic clicking of a cheap plastic pen. Across the mahogany conference table, Julian sat hunched in a chair that seemed to swallow him whole. The transformation was jarring. The golden boy who had once filled every room with his booming entitlement was gone, replaced by a man whose expensive Italian suit was now a size too large and frayed at the cuffs. His skin was sallow, and the arrogance in his eyes had been replaced by a frantic, darting desperation. He was no longer the heir apparent. He was a man facing a mountain of litigation and a desert of credit. "You don't have to do this, Elena," Julian said, his voice cracking. He reached for a glass of water, his hand trembling so violently that the ice rattled against the rim. "The manor. It's been in the family for 3 generations. You're selling our history to a hotel group." "I'm not selling history, Julian," she replied, her voice as calm and steady as a heartbeat. "I'm liquidating a liability. The debts you accrued in Father's name have to be paid. This is the only way to keep you out of a cell, though I suspect the prosecutors will still find plenty to discuss regarding your creative accounting." He let out a sharp, bitter laugh that lacked any of its former power. "You always were the cold one. Father knew it. That's why he never gave you the keys to the kingdom. He knew you'd burn it all down just to see the glow." Elena didn't flinch. This was the rage spike she had expected, the dying gasp of a man who still believed the world owed him a throne. "He didn't give me the keys because he knew I'd be the only one strong enough to survive the crash you were inevitably going to cause," she said, leaning forward. "And I didn't burn it down. I just turned on the lights. You're the one who couldn't stand what they revealed." She pushed a final set of documents across the table. These were the papers that officially severed his connection to the Vance holdings, providing him a modest monthly stipend under a strict spendthrift trust she controlled. It was a mercy he didn't deserve, but one she provided for the sake of the name he had dragged through the mud. Julian stared at the pen in his hand as if it were a weapon pointed at his own chest. "Mom won't even see me," he whispered, a sudden, pathetic vulnerability breaking through his crust of bitterness. "She's in that cottage in the Hamptons, staring at the sea. She won't take my calls." "Beatrice Vance is learning the price of her silence," Elena said, and for a fleeting second, a shadow of grief crossed her face. The cost of her victory wasn't measured in dollars, but in the silence that now existed between her and her mother. Beatrice had chosen her son's ego over her daughter's truth for 30 years, and the realization had left the older woman a ghost in her own life. Elena had tried to visit once, but the gates had remained closed. Some wounds didn't heal. They just became part of the landscape. Julian finally signed the papers, the ink bleeding slightly into the grain of the page. He stood up, looking around the sleek office as if searching for a way to reclaim his status through sheer force of will. "You think you won," he spat, trying to summon one last shred of the old Julian. "But you're alone, Elena. You've got your money and your firm, but you've got no one." "I have exactly who I need," she replied. As if on cue, the door opened and Silas Thorne stepped in. He wasn't wearing the driver's uniform anymore. He was in a tailored suit, carrying a folder of new client acquisitions. He gave Julian a brief, dismissive glance, the kind one gives a piece of litter on a sidewalk, before turning to Elena with a respectful nod. "The car is ready for Leo's school recital," Silas said, "and the auditors from the city firm are waiting in the lounge. They're eager to start the new contract." Julian's face went through a series of rapid, painful contortions, shock, envy, and finally, a crushing realization. He had mocked Silas for years, calling him a servant. Now, Silas was the right hand of the most powerful forensic firm in the state, while Julian was a man with a bus ticket and a tarnished name. He didn't say another word. He turned and walked out, his shoulders slumped, disappearing into the hallway where no one turned to watch him go. Elena stayed at the window for a long moment after he left. She watched the street below, seeing the black town car waiting to take her to her son. She had won. The predators were caged, the truth was documented, and the Vance legacy had been pruned back to its healthy roots. She picked up a small, framed photograph on her desk. It wasn't a formal portrait. It was a candid shot Silas had taken a few weeks ago, Elena and Leo sitting on a bench in the park, laughing at something the boy had said. She looked at her own expression in the photo, the tension gone from her jaw, the light back in her eyes. She was the majority shareholder of her life now. It had cost her a brother and a mother, but as she walked toward the door to meet her son, she knew the price had been worth the freedom. She reached out and flicked the light switch, leaving the past in the dark as she stepped out into the sun.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.